Good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome to this Landor Green Transport Recovery series of webinars. And today we are talking about perhaps one of the hottest, perhaps the hottest topics going around at the moment, e-scooters in the UK modal mix. I'm Richard Dilks, I'm your chair for today. My day job is as Chief Exec of COMO UK. COMO UK is short for Collaborative Mobility UK. We're a charity for the public benefit of shared transport. We are perhaps like shared transport, dare I say, entering into some sort of phase of adulthood now. We'll turn 21 this year. We started as a support network for car clubs and then broadened out to include bikes. We now cover e-scooters as well via an operator membership category and regular fortnightly fora with local authorities and close engagement with the DFT. And we've also got interests in 2+ car sharing and flexible bus in all aspects of shared transport, in other words, and how it fits in with sustainable transport more broadly. I'm delighted to share this today. I'm also the speaker for section 3, so I will pop up then again. You'll see me on camera when I'm talking, just as with our other panelists. Otherwise, I'll go off into the background. We have Q&A at the end of this session, so as questions come to you as we go along, do feel free to pop them into the question box, and I'll be then fishing them out of there when we come to that section, which is the final half hour from 11:30 to 12. And in each section before that, covering 4 different topics, we'll be hearing from whichever panelists want to speak, and then we will also be having some polls pop up on the screen. They are quick, they're 20 seconds on screen, colleagues at Landor tell me, so be fleet of foot about those, please. So delighted to introduce our panelists, and I'll ask them to turn their webcams on as I go through this list. We have Brian Deegan from Urban Movement, David Davis from PACTS, Mark Collins from Transport for West Midlands, Luke Borzewski and Nick Davis as a double act from University of Salford, Kerry Woolsgrove from the European Cyclists Federation, and Lorna Stevenson from the University of Westminster. Welcome all. So let us get going into the first section, which is speed and safety. Now, I know all panelists want to offer some thoughts on this, so I'll just invite whoever would like to go first to do that. But please be mindful that each section is 15 minutes or so, so you have to keep your contributions shorter because all of you want to speak. So over to you.
Do you want me to go, or just well for the order Brian. That we popped up? Yeah,
that's the spirit.
That's fine. Yeah, just wanted to make a point. So we're talking about safety, but for me, like particularly when it comes to cycling, which I'm mainly representing, but I'm definitely going to be making a case for e-scooters today. We've tried to move away from strictly talking about road safety to talk about road danger reduction. So the first point I want to make about e-scooters is they're not particularly dangerous. They might be annoying to people, and we're certainly having lots of incidents of people being annoyed or slightly vexed or even mildly perturbed, but they're not actually causing collisions. Internationally, we're talking 4% of the collisions that have happened involve pedestrians. It's the dangerous ones that are the problem, and it's the cars.
We've lost Brian there, obviously. Let's just wait a couple more moments to see if it comes back. Otherwise, I'll move us along.
Very similar to cyclists. We can sort out some.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll move on to David. David Davis.
Well, good morning. Safety is obviously PAC's specialist area, but I would like to say, first of all, we're very positive about the whole active travel initiative. We very much support more walking, cycling, things like electrically assisted pedal cycles, cargo bikes, and that sort of thing. So, you know, we are very much mindful of also what Brian was saying about danger reduction, which fits very much in with the sort of modern view of safe system approach to safety. But I think we have looked, having gone from a position of actually not being terribly bothered about e-scooters at all, partly perhaps because they weren't in the UK very much. We've gone from a position of not being concerned to being increasingly concerned. And it's important, I think, to look at studies which are relevant to the UK. Transport for London, in their evidence to the Transport Select Committee, calculate that the risks from e-scooter riders are something like 100 times those for pedal cyclists in London. So I think it's important to look at the data that relates to the UK. I mean, you can go online and see all sorts of horrendous images of injuries to pedestrians and particularly to scooter riders from around the world. And we entirely recognise that nothing is risk-free. So as I say, we're very supportive of things like cycling. And we recognise, of course, that 80% of deaths involve a motor vehicle. But that's not quite the same thing as saying, well, it doesn't matter. Most e-scooter rider injuries come from the scooter rider coming off, not collision with a motor vehicle. And the extent to which saying e-scooters are safer than cars is only really valid if you're talking about trips transferred from cars to scooters. And I'm afraid a lot of the analysis has completely ignored the trips transferred from walking and cycling and public transport to e-scooters, which is a much riskier mode.
Thank you. Brian, we have you back. Let's come back to you and hope the connection works better this time.
Yeah, I was getting towards it. Really, I kind of knew what David was going to say, so I wanted to give that kind of a real danger perspective right off the start, really. And it's interesting the point he just made about the switch trips, really, and I wanted to make that point. That was the final one I was going to make. It's a question of whether we're more like our European allies or whether we're more like America and Australia. And the American reports I've seen, particularly from Portland, have shown like a 35 to 48% switch from car trips. So are we more like those? And I just saw some stats from Brisbane today where it's a 22% switch from car trips. So I just wanted to put those points in there because I kind of thought David might make that, really. But generally, from my point of view, these things aren't dangerous. It's just then the onus is on me as a designer to keep them safe. And I quite relish doing that challenge. So I think there's a lot of shared issues with cyclists. Thanks for coming back to me. Sorry about dropping out.
No worries at all. Lorna, could we come to you next?
Yeah, good morning. And I think a lot of similar issues from what we've heard. I kind of am taking the position that e-scooters are coming to the UK now. That cat is out of the bag. And what we're seeing from a lot of other places looking at working out their injury rate is wishing that they had better stats. So saying, oh, we'd like to know the injury rate, but sometimes scooters are coded as mopeds, sometimes they're coded as bikes. So assuming there are some local authorities on this call who are thinking about having an e-scooter trial, one of the things I would be saying to you is to get your ducks in the row now. How are you going to monitor that injury rate? It's something at Westminster we went through yesterday, thinking about what are the key data sets that we would find out about injury rates for bikes and cars. Is there a code for e-scooters? And yeah, I think echoing what others have said, there is a morally defensible position that we should only allow things which are safer than our current safest methods of travel, because if it's not better than what we have, why bother bring it in? But equally, that anything that is at least as safe as our least safe current method of travel could also be justified on the basis that we have a benchmark, and anything below that would be okay. So thinking about the fact that we're going to have these trials and we're going to have to decide at the end of these trials whether or not we want to continue having e-scooters on the road, to start having discussions about what levels of safety might be acceptable, whether or not that would vary with other impacts. Is it okay if they are less safe if they are more green? To think about safety for users and safety for other road users. And I think also picking up that point that Brian made about fear. I know we'll probably hear a lot about trips to the Nearly Hospital, but about how we recognise fear as a legitimate concern for cyclists, and so do we also need to recognise fear as a legitimate concern for other road users like pedestrians? Yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you. Kerry, could I come to you next? Kerry, I think you're on mute.
So, yeah, I'm off mute. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Kerry Walsgrove from the European Cyclists Federation. We represent the national cycling associations here in Brussels at the European level. I think for cyclists, it's an interesting issue. It's we do see a couple of problems, particularly on sharing the cycling infrastructure. I think the cycling infrastructure is going to have to improve, particularly in countries like the UK, where the cycling infrastructure in some areas is fantastic. I mean, there's some really good routes in London, and Bristol's a good cycling city. I know Brian's doing lots of work in Manchester at the moment. There's some really good stuff going on up there. But for much of the infrastructure across the UK, it's a painted line by the side of the road where cyclists interact with the glass and the drain covers and the gutters. And cyclists barely manage with pneumatic tyres and large wheels, let alone the smaller wheels of the scooters. So if you're going to have scooters and see this as a genuine way of moving people from cars to scooters, which is good, that's great, then you're going to have to seriously consider again and again taking space away from motor vehicles and using it for pedestrians, cyclists and scooters, because I don't want this to be a battle between cyclists, scooters and pedestrians. That's not what it's about. It's about motorized vehicles and then moving motorized vehicles onto scooters, preferably bicycles, and walking and public transport, of course. So it's about space, and it's about providing more space and better infrastructure for those modes in general.
Thank you. Luke, could I come to you next?
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to sort of follow on from a couple of Lorna's points, actually. She mentioned fear, and I think that's a really good point to start on when we're talking about safety. I think a lot of the discussion, quite rightly, around e-scooters is looking at safety in terms of the rider and the safety of pedestrians and drivers, and and how all these things are going to be interacting. I think one of the interesting points to think about as well is that feelings of safety go beyond just drivers and the riders of e-scooters. Feelings of safety can sort of move into pedestrians, and I know there's been a lot of talk about people within sort of the visually impaired community and campaign groups in the UK expressing concerns about how they're going to feel on the pavement. I know these sort of discussions came up a lot during dockless bike share schemes during the big boom a couple of years ago in the UK of sort of the dockless schemes having a tendency to sort of spill over onto pavements and blocking pedestrianised rights of way. And I think e-scooters, because of their silence, which is a lovely thing for an active travel mode in a city to be quiet, unfortunately comes with that sort of the slightly negative consequence of people who might not might have a various visual impairment, might not be able to see or hear them coming, and then that poses an additional challenge for planners and operators and the general public more widely.
Thank you. Last but not least, Mark, could we come to you?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So just a few reflections from myself, Transport for West Midlands related. I think safety is clearly a key consideration. We as a region are actively trying to promote the trial, and we've put together a nice trial which we think will test some of the parameters of what is both acceptable for use, and also that we can take some quite holistic view on what success looks like. So clearly it has to be safe as a benchmark, but equally the benefit that having scooters brings for levels of social inclusion, environmental benefits, how it fits in with the sort of wider ecosystem of transport measures that we've got in the West Midlands. It's quite a complex beast, and so we're quite keen to see how e-scooters can contribute in that respect. So I think one of context is clearly important for us to try and understand in this respect. In terms of sort of safety and speed specifically, I think there's a lot being made about the maximum speed that's been allowed by the DFT. For us, we are actively looking at best practice around the world and seeing where areas of the zones that we've highlighted we can actually deploy around specified geo-fenced areas of no-go. So are there particular types of junctions which cause problems? Are there particular types of infrastructure which cause issue? There's a level of technology that potentially we can apply to this so that we can stop levels of pavement riding, for example, so illegal behaviour as defined. And I think also the education and training aspect of this is going to be absolutely critical, not only for the rider, but also the awareness that we can try and promote as part of the general populace as well. So
these things are sort of a work in progress, but are absolutely key considerations for us. There are potential mitigations around geofencing, things like that, that we can try and deploy, and these are clearly working with the likes of ROSPA and some of the sort of blind societies, etc. We're actively trying to engage those groups to see how we can best reflect some of these concerns and actually make a trial which is inclusive and safe for as many people as possible.
Thank you. David, you wanted to come back. Can you do that very briefly, please? And then we will move to our first poll. We've got a set of polls to cover in this section. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I'd just like to comment particularly on another aspect of safety, which is the vehicle itself and some of the inherent risks. And in relation to the trials, we were surprised, or very surprised and dismayed, that the government has chosen to authorise the fastest option and a much, much heavier and much more powerful option than was suggested. So that is a particular risk, not only to the riders, but also to pedestrians. So I think that has puzzled us. And whereas actually some of the suppliers have recommended other safety standards, such as minimum wheel size, that doesn't appear to have been specified in the trial. So we are a bit concerned and surprised that they haven't gone for a safer option in the trials. And of course, the other final point is, of course, there's nothing relating to all the private users who, although they should not be on the roads, clearly are.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure these issues will be prompting thoughts in people's minds. So as we go along, please do make use of the question box, which is looking a little bit lonely at the moment. And can we move on to our first poll, please? Okay, so please get voting. As it says there, panelists can't vote, but all you lovely attendees can. I told you it was going to be quick. The results flashing up on screen. Oh, and flashing away again, I think. Oh, we're back. Good. Okay, so the sharing point is the key one there. Noted. And we may, when we get into Q&A discussion later, we'll be able to pull these results back up to help inform our chat. Should we move to the next poll then, please? Okay, so a clear preference in favour of regulation, which I think broadly is where we're heading in this country, although lots of steps still to be taken. And on to our next poll.
Feel free to add any comments you wish, Richard, while the polls are being taken.
Thank you, Juliana. Will do. Remember how quick these are, so vote now or forever hold your peace. And quite a split there, but obviously with car in the lead, which I think makes lots of intuitive sense. And on to our next poll, please. Okay, it'll close soon. And we have one more poll to go after this in this section. An overwhelming vote for car in that. Last poll, please. Thank you. This is about speed limiting scooters, where the government has gone for a limit on the trials, but of course it would take primary legislation in this country to make them legal long term, and it will remain to be seen what any speed limit might be in that. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for contributing there. Do throw more questions into the question box. I can see some coming through, which is great. And let us move along to our next section, which is impact on active travel and modal share. So some panelists have already touched on this, and it's undoubtedly going to be a key area of debate when it comes to e-scooters in the UK. Again, all panelists want to come into this, so please, with your contributions, be mindful of time and keep things brief. Shall we start the other way around? And I'll start with Mark, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is an absolute key consideration for us. Our sort of measures of success are absolutely how much we can get a modal shift from qualified non-sustainable forms of transport, those of single car occupant journeys, to more sustainable forms of transport. So what we don't want to do is cannibalise our public transport fleet in order to preference e-scooters or equally other already taken sustainable forms of transport, walking, cycling, etc. into this. Recognising, however, some cannibalisation is absolutely going to happen. So for us, it's what messaging can we put out there which appeals to the car user that actually means that we can actually get some of that sort of modal activity and modal shift that is preference for us. And that, I think, for me is going to go back to understanding things around customer need, customer experience, and customer journey. So what is it that drives people into the car? How can we incentivize movement of those sort of trigger points and actually have the e-scooter appeal to those? So things around convenience, time efficiency, flexibility, things that the e-scooter really can offer car drivers that can sort of look to offer them an alternative choice which they seem viable. I think that's going to be the absolute key thing and a way of messaging that we're sort of developing and working at the moment. The only other point I sort of make on this is that, and it's related to one that came earlier, success in this trial could also mean failure as well at the same time, and we're really sort of cognizant of that, in that the only legal aspect for this trial is that people rent the scooters that are available to them, whereas we expect people might actually see those as a viable alternative and actually go out and purchase them. So that's good to drive an ethos of e-scooter usership, but equally those are therefore actually illegal scooters that people are picking up if they just purchase them themselves and use on the road. So we're also conscious that a level of success for the trial actually might mean it's failure at the same time. So we've got to try and manage that as well. And that's again part of this education and messaging piece.
Thank you, Mark. Brian, I'll come to you next.
Great, yeah, 3 quick points to make. One about, like, are the active travel? There's been some talk about that they're not particularly active. I would state the case that they are. Anytime you're holding a limb up against gravity, you're going to be doing some work. And I just think fundamentally, particularly with the rental model, there's going to be at least 2 walking trips associated with every one e-scooter trip. So I'm hoping that pedestrian organisations will see that this is a way of generating extra walking trips and getting some activity into people's lives, even if you're not perhaps doing as much work as on a bike or if you're walking. So I definitely want to make that point. From the cycling side of things, for me, this is a real chance to get another ally. We want all the same things. You need quiet streets, and if it's a quiet street, then the scooters will use it. They won't go on the footway the same way cyclists go on footways if the street's too busy or there's too many cars or there's too much risk there. So we've got a real ally for getting low traffic neighbourhoods, and also protection on some of the busy roads. As Kerry said at the start, we have got some really poor infrastructure. If lots of people start using these scooters, then we can get some better infrastructure in there. So for me, they go at the same speed roughly as bikes, and it's a similar thing to contend with. We might have to be a little bit more wary of road surface conditions, but absolutely, I'm seeing this as another potential ally, really. And there aren't many people using it at the moment, so maybe they haven't got a stronger voice. But when we do get people using it, that's more people campaigning for better streets, less streets that are not as dominated by car traffic and the movements around there. So they're the key points I want to make. So they are active, and we need all the friends we can get.
All right, thank you. Lorna, can I come to you? Okay, the battle with the
Sorry,
mute
no,
button.
there we go. I've just found the button. Sorry, I was looking up some stats, so my box was hidden. Yeah, so I think a couple of things have already been mentioned. I think there is where we are in time and space. So where we are in time is the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. I get to bingo the first person to mention that. So I think when we think about mode shift, I can definitely see that there might be more leeway for e-scooters now when we want to discourage people from public transport. And I also think there will be an interesting question perhaps in a year's time when we're at the end of the trials, when e-scooters are still here, and perhaps we might want to start nudging people back from scooters onto public transport, or we might not. It depends what we see in terms of the carbon impact from e-scooters or the social impact from e-scooters. But I think we do have to bear in mind that our success criteria for what is good at the moment might be different from what is good in 12 or 24 months' time. Then I also think there's spatial differences. So there are cities like London that have an excellent offering of a range of public transport that is quite energy efficient. What we've seen in the most recent research from Paris is that there has been a lot of modal shift from public transport and walking, and relatively little modal shift from cars and taxis. But there are also cities that are not a lot like London and are a lot more like those US cities where we've seen a much greater shift from cars and taxis. And so we would expect to see mixed results. Something I've just jotted down, which is a not fully formed thought, is about the shift from walking. And I am based in the Active Travel Academy. I love walking. I think walking is fantastic. It has this massive range of benefits. But if we were planning a road building intervention that might give car users a 50% travel time saving, that would be a massive saving in travel time and would almost certainly be built. So the idea that perhaps e-scooters might offer people who don't drive but instead walk perhaps a 50% travel time saving, is it better to give people that option? And obviously there will be health disbenefits there, but as Brian's pulled out, there will be short walking journeys. But I think you need to bear in mind the benefit of giving people options, obviously balanced against safety and fear concerns that might limit other people's options.
Thank you, really interesting. Kerry, can I come to you next and start to put the time squeeze on a little, I'm afraid. Apologies, that's a bit unfair.
Yeah, okay, no worries. Yeah, I mean, there's the research that I've seen is for, I mean, there's the Danish Road Authority, there's Brussels Mobility have done some work as well as some studies from Paris, and all of them are showing that the majority of modal shift is coming from walking and public transport, less so from bikes, and not so much from cars. There is a lot of movement from cars to scooters in the US, but the problem with the US is you don't have people cycling or walking or using public transport. So the only mode you can move from is from cars, really. So it's a bit different, very different from European cities. But as Lorna did mention, we have the COVID issue, second person, and now we are moving away from public transport. So that's okay. We seem to be moving away from public transport. I don't see, the Brussels Mobility Study did not see people wanting to buy new scooters. They like the spontaneousness of the rental system. So I don't know if we'll be seeing people actually buying new scooters per se. I think they like to see them as part of different trips, especially from walking. And agree with the ally point for Brian. I think this is a good opportunity for us to start moving ahead and start saying, if you are going to have scooters which are on the cycling infrastructure, we really have to have better infrastructure. And finally, I think we need to have some perspective on scooter use. In Paris, which has about 30,000 scooters and has about 10 different shared scooter services, it's a huge number in quite a dense city. It's still only about 1% of the modal share of trips, between 0.8 and 1.2. So some perspective on the safety and the modal shift at the moment. They're not like taking over the world. They're still quite a small number in a city which has lots of them.
Thank you so much. Luke, I'll come to you next.
Okay, thanks. I'll also be quick, and then I'll make a couple of points, and then I'll pass it on to my colleague Nick to say a few words as well. Third person to mention the COVID crisis, but obviously very important to talk about it. I think Kerry and Lorna raised some really valid points. The point that I'd sort of like to add about that is that obviously we've seen an unprecedented change in our sort of public spaces and our local environmental spaces over the last 3 months. We've seen more people cycling, more people walking, you accessing green space, appreciating what's on their doorstep, developing a new relationship with what is on their doorstep. And with that, I think comes an obvious huge opportunity to think about active travel and travel modes, while the idea of this sort of healthy, active way of engaging with public spaces in people's minds, particularly because infrastructure has also been changing slightly. In Manchester, which I can speak about because I'm based here, we've seen a lot of pop-up cycle lanes and sort of expanded walking lanes for people to socially distance and travel around safely. So I think while it's in people's minds, it's a good opportunity to engage with the public and bring them on board. But I'll also pass over to my colleague Nick to say a couple of comments now, if that's okay.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Luke said, we've done a couple of reviews of evidence, like secondary evidence on what's been happening elsewhere. And actually, yes, COVID has changed what people are doing with regards to public transport, but research from before COVID in France shows that people were already replacing public transport trips with e-scooter trips as well. So there is definitely a potential there. Also, there's a tourism element as well. So Lisbon, for instance, has 8 different companies operating there. And they found that many people are taking trips with other people. So you need to think about the recreational trips as well that could be taken using e-scooters. And then finally, won't name a name, but a major player, we had a roundtable with them last year. They actually argued, and it's not been proved, but okay, there's possibly no physical benefits to using an e-scooter, but they argued that there is maybe a well-being benefit as well. So you can get endorphins from using one. You're outside in the fresh air as well. These are the things that we can take as positives, obviously. It's maybe not the most active form of travel, but it's something that we can add into the mix. And as Brian said earlier on, it's another mode that takes people away from cars potentially as well.
Okay, thank you. David, could we come to you, mindful of time, and then we'll get into our polls in this section. Thanks.
Sure. So I will mention COVID-19. It's being used as a big justification for the government's trials, but I think it's also important to bear in mind that the government is by no means discouraging car use at the moment. We've seen all sorts of free parking schemes and so forth. So I think we've got to be very careful about saying this is a fantastic alternative when actually there is not any, I think, intention on the government's part to really discourage car use. So that's one thing. I think we could do some research into the degree of health and active travel benefit, absolutely. But all the stuff I've read suggests that the active travel element, the health element, is small. And I think we really have to look at it, balance it, and say, okay, we might take some trips off cars, which is healthy. But how many walking trips are we going to lose as a consequence? And if we have e-scooters littering the pavements, as we see in many European cities, how much of a deterrent to walking, and particularly to people who are visually impaired, is that going to be? So I think we've got to look at it as a balance. You know, the government has made quite clear, you know, that they want to support walking and cycling. Active travel is their priority. We're very strongly in favour of pop-up cycle lanes and extra wide pavements and that sort of thing that have been provided. And that is fantastic opportunity. But if we have 15.5-mile-an-hour scooters, that'll be faster than most cyclists. So there's no incentive there to take a bike ride or walk.
Okay, thank you. Let us move into our first poll for this section, please. Okay, asking about the impact on modal share. These are only open for about 20 seconds, so do be quick. And we should be able to see the answers. So quite an interesting mix there, informed by what our speakers have been saying, I think, but also some hope it will be replacement of car trips. Let's move to the next quick poll. Thank you. I'll close very soon. In the meantime, thanks for putting questions into the question box. Okay, very interesting. I think we'll be calling on these when we get into the Q&A later on. Right, I shall move us along through to section 3. I'll ask the other panel to turn the cameras off just for this, as I'm talking to it briefly. If that's all right with everybody. This is the perils of not attending a meeting. I found myself slightly volunteered to speak in this category, so I take off my chair hat and pop on my COMA UK hat. So these are just some outline thoughts from me, which I will keep fairly brief. Overall, worth remembering that these are very early days for the UK. That may seem very, very obvious thing to say, but they really are. We've had the first scheme announced in Tees Valley, some others that no doubt be announced very soon. These are time limited and area limited. So we have shifted forwards in terms of having these things in rental format, running around some parts of our country. But it's very, very different to having them be lawful, as in most actually other developed countries in the world. And that would require primary legislation, as I touched on earlier. So it's a way of saying what we have now is not necessarily what we will have, even perhaps by some time later through the trials next year, possibly, but is probably a bit different to what we'll end up with if we get legislation. And that goes to vehicle design, speed, acceleration rates, weight distribution, all the aspects, safety and otherwise of that. Goes to parking and pickup, and where these scooters would be allowed to be, etc. So on business models, we've got a big range actually here, perhaps bigger than is realized. I think there's an understandable recognition of and therefore focus on bigger players who certainly are there in the market. Quite a lot from the States and also a few from Asia Pacific region, but there are also homegrown British players. There are some who have thousands and thousands of scooters operating in multiple cities and countries already. There are some who are putative operators who don't actually have anything running yet. So there's a huge spectrum at this point. That will quite quickly narrow down as we get to the trial areas being set up. One thing within this that gets talked about a lot is docked or dockless. I think probably the reality will be somewhere in the middle for the trial areas. The details are all still to be thrashed out on this, in particular between authorities and operators for each area, but also in terms of what DFT wants to see here. But what I mean by being between is that docked, if we think of the very intensive version of docking that the Santander Cycle Hire scheme in London has, that's expensive, that takes time to put in. Each of those has power routed to it and connectivity and so on and on. So speed alone and COVID response timings dictate that you can't have all scooters in trial areas going into those sorts of things. But equally, there will be a lot of focus, and I think this is quite right, on where these things are parked, whether they're being dropped off or picked up. So I think there'll be a big impetus from authorities to have some sort of control over this, some sort of geofencing capability, and also in street level, some places to put these things. You know, at base level, that could be getting out some spray paint I think it's a consensus view now actually among operators, and this very much maps over to what we've been seeing with bike share, that there's a recognition on operators' side that something along those lines is in fact the way to go, and is a way of coming together as allies, to use Brian's word from earlier, and to minimizing harms to users, but also very importantly to non-users. Membership is in the title of this section, so we will have various, I think, sort of models of user membership. There will probably be a fee to join, but not necessarily. Other parts of shared transport we've seen joining fees evaporate away, particularly actually in Car Club. So it's not necessarily a pay to join model. Remains to be seen what we see in terms of charge rates per mile and time blend. There are some operators who are looking to do a longer term rental, so this isn't all just about per 5 minutes or per half an hour per hour. There's some who are looking to do sort of per week or per month models, and that is within scope. The FT have confirmed of these trials, so it'll be interesting to see if any of that happens. I mentioned that at Como we have an operator membership category that is similar to what we run in Car Club and Bike Share, but with the difference that in Car Club and Bike Share we are accrediting those operators. So we have an accreditation process that we're taking them through, which has various requirements about quality of operations, about redistributing vehicles from where they shouldn't be, about financial status and insurance cover and so on. We're not running accreditation of scooter operators. It seems to us just too early to be able to bring that forwards, but it's something we keep very much in mind, and we want to be learning from these trials as we go along, as I think we all do. Operational guidelines lastly then. So the government has set out guidance which is on their website and free available for anyone to go and read about what it wants to see. At a top level, that covers a lot of areas, but it does leave some leeway on most areas for local authorities to have some influence, some deciding power as well, which seems to me broadly a sensible balance to try and strike. So government has set rules, as we were just panelists were touching on, about vehicle design and wheel size and speed and so on. They've been fairly permissive. I think in the interests of speed, this is a COVID response measure. This is a piece of secondary legislation tweaking that's gone on to enable this to happen. I don't think you should read across that that's what scooters would look like in UK in the long term necessarily. Other countries have gone on a similar path actually of the vehicles coming in the first instance, learning from those, then legislating as to what vehicles are actually wanted. Germany in particular comes to mind there. And then there are these tweakable aspects for local authorities about geofencing, so speed limits. Although that is DFT defined up to a point, local authorities in trial areas can actually control speed if they want to with operators' agreement, and if they don't get the agreement, then they don't have to have a trial going ahead. So you can cap speed over a whole area or a smaller area within a trial area. We at Como, we've drawn up some high-level principles for what we think would be good practice for authorities and for operators. We're inputting a lot on data right now. We're also just pulling together a paper on safety. And we want to continue to have some common positions between authorities and operators on some of these key aspects, and then learn from these trials as we go along, which I think is actually perhaps one of the most important things here, if we're to have any sort of significant impact from scooters in mode shift, and think about the climate crisis as well as the COVID crisis. So that's quite enough from me. Let us move into our polls for this section, please. And we have 3, starting with where should they be permitted to park? So please vote quickly as ever. Okay, big vote for docking stations there. Very interesting. Thank you for that. Let's move to our next poll. This is best place, but it's best sort of type of place, I guess. City beasts clearly in your view. Thank you for that. And the last question in this section. Thank you, Mark, who's running all this behind the scenes. This is a great question, I think. I really want to see what the answer is to this. Closing soon. Okay, no's just in the lead, but with a good chunk of yeses as well. And a preponderance for hiring. Super, thank you all. Let us move into our final section before we get into Q&A, please. And I'll ask panelists to turn cameras back on if they're wanting to speak here. Certainly, Lorna, I believe you wanted to contribute to this section, but open to any of you to come in as well. Let's start off with Lorna if we can.
Okay, I was not wholly expecting to contribute to this section. I think picking up a lot of the issues that you talked about in the previous section, there are various levers that local authorities can pull. I'm really interested to hear from West Midlands here. I think the social justice and the capacity for scooters to mitigate transport disadvantage is potentially quite interesting, but very much dependent on the model. And I think the models that we are likely to get in this initial year of just having rental e-scooters are likely to have a relatively limited impact on that. We have seen elsewhere that the kind of classic short-term pick it up and drop it off hire tends to have affluent white men riding them. But there are ways that you can tweak that by having requirements about where your scooters are distributed, about having requirements for subsidised rides. Obviously, all of that adds costs onto the operator, and if you're having a lot of redistribution, also adds a carbon impact. So thinking about it in that way. With my academic hat on, I am really interested in the parallels between deregulated buses, but I know that is a very niche interest, so I'm not going to sit on it. I think that is all that I have to say there, apart from the fact that, again, as an academic, it will be very interesting for me to see 30 or 40 different local areas, potentially with a lot of variation in the requirements that they put in. And then we can really see which requirements seem to work to give us the most successful outcomes.
Thank you for that. Apologies for coming to you if you weren't quite expecting it. Who else would like to come in? Just raise a hand on camera and I'll come to you. Nick, let's come to you then.
Yeah, just really quickly. So Luke and I and some colleagues at Salford did a study on a dockless bike share scheme of an organisation I'm not going to name in Greater Manchester a couple of years ago. And we learned quite a lot from that in terms of how local authorities should act. What it taught us is that they need to be a lot more involved in the delivery of the scheme, because the engagement was a really key factor why that didn't actually succeed as a scheme. I think if you roll out an e-scooter scheme, that is probably the main consideration. But also the same study did tell us that there were major inequalities as well in terms of accessibility. So as Lorna said just before, it is a certain demographic of people that were taking up the scheme, and there were definitely people who were not able to, for reasons of gender, for reasons of where they lived in relation to where the scheme was, so it was all very centralised, who weren't able to access it. And these are all things that local authorities need to be thinking about before they actually implement a e-scooter scheme.
Thank you, Mark. Your camera's playing up, but I believe you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something from a Transport for West Midlands perspective we've been wrestling with. So I think to Nick's point, we have taken the decision to be very actively involved in prescribing how this would work. So both from a combined authority and also local authority perspective, working very closely with each of the incumbent authorities. We've taken a position of active management. One to make sure that we can both be very prescriptive around where they can operate, and also that we can align ourselves to any of the sort of safety or training requirements that are necessary to have a safe trial. And the other one really is the qualification of monitoring and evaluation. So what does success look like? For us, we've got a perspective on the slightly longer game of, yes, this is a trial, but actually what can we learn from this about whether a long-term solution around e-scooter use is actually viable for the West Midlands? So working with the DFT, there's a view around cross area and also intra area. So we have other programs running that are going to look very specifically at chosen locations within our zones, doing a very deep dive, looking at behavior, looking at attitude, as well as some of the use characteristics that are going on, and also some of the modal split as well. So we're looking at this as an opportunity to learn a great deal about how the general public actually embrace e-scooters, what messaging they respond to, and use that as a mechanism to make judgments about what is appropriate future legislation, policy, etc., for their use.
Thank you. Apologies, struggling to find the unmute button myself. Anyone else would like to come in from the panelists on this section? Brian, let's come to you first. Sorry, you got your hand up slightly quicker.
Right, so I just turned myself off then. Sorry. Yeah, just wanted to make a quick point really for local authorities to take a little bit of a libertarian stance really. You can say, well, if we don't want e-scooters on the footway, provide nice conditions on the carriageway for them. So there's always that impetus on the designer's responsibility, and that's the lesson that I want to learn from dockless bikes as well. Don't just let it happen and just see what goes on and then go, oh, it's a problem. But we've got planning and we've got design engineering, we've got regulations, so we can put ourselves on the right foot. And like I'll say the point again, and probably will again before the end, it's about creating better streets for everybody, and better streets will work for e-scooters, and it'll stop the impact on pedestrians. So for me, we're all knit together on this one. And I'll also mention the point first mentioned today for mobility as a service. This seems to be the most popular version of it around the world. So we're moving towards people not owning their own vehicles and a more equitable share of transport across the system. Then this is a really popular way of getting there. So I really support it from that view as well. It's not up to local authorities to just talk about the policy of that. It's now you can start making inroads towards that effect. So that's the key points I wanted to make here. Thanks.
Super, thank you. David, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. We are urging local authorities to take an active role in the whole schemes, and particularly to choose schemes with scooters which have safety features, best safety features, because we think it's much more likely to be successful if you don't have such heavy, fast scooters with small wheels and so forth, mixing particularly with pedestrians and cyclists. They shouldn't be with pedestrians. And on that point, we are urging local authorities to publish their plans to make that a reality. It's all we are saying they are banned from the pavement, but in fact, we know at the moment scooters are banned completely, but they're used on the pavements and they're used on the roads. So I don't see why compliance should suddenly improve when they're actually authorised. And also the other thing we'd just like to emphasise is the monitoring. We're very, very keen to learn from these trials. And I think it's very important that we enable groups who may be most disadvantaged, such as visually impaired, pedestrians who are, you might say, peripheral to it, to comment in ways that are easy for them to comment, in real time, not in some sort of questionnaire at the end of the whole process.
Thank you. Kerry, did you want to come in here? I think you did.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, we're still scarred by the impact of what we called the pirate bikes back from 2016 from the I think Ofo and Mobike, these services where they just basically imported thousands of plastic bicycles into cities, and people would download an app and you would just go and off you go. There's no redistribution. The bicycles themselves were terrible, and they piled up outside the bottom of hills and outside places where people wanted to go, and it was a very rare bad image day for cycling. So it is absolutely imperative that you do have interaction between the public authorities and the actual operators, and there are good regulations in place. Paris is an interesting example. They have lots and lots of different services on there. They have no pavement use, or if you do have pavement use, it's under 10 kilometers per hour. They have geofencing that they may be putting in place. They also have parking zones, which perhaps might be difficult for the free floating systems. And if you park in the wrong place and you block the pavement, then the operators get fined if they want their scooters back. So that forces the operators to try and nudge the behaviour of the users as well. So it's crucial that you have good regulations. Otherwise, we will end up with a situation like we did with the pirate bikes back in 2016, which are mostly gone by now.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the clock, I'll move us on to our polls for this section. These are the final polls, and then we can get into the general Q&A. Thank you very much for all the questions popping up. Some great stuff in there. Do keep them coming. Okay, so a question about sharing data. I think that wins my personal award for least surprising results so far. But quite understandable. Let's move to our last poll, please. Okay, so avoiding making some of the mistakes of the doctor's bike experience. Okay, super, thank you. Certainly I'd support that collaboration with local authorities point very much. Thank you. Let's move into the general Q&A section, please. So if all speakers could have their cameras on if they're able to. Mark, we understand if you can't. And I will start asking some of the questions that have been piling into the question box. So could we start with what weighting should be placed on total life cycle emissions? So manufacture, operation, charging when selecting e-scooter operators. And with all of these, anyone who wants to come in, please do so. I'll referee it all if needed. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's quite important. I'm surprised that that's not part of the vehicle regulations or some of the other regulations within the projects, because a lot of the research has shown that the environmental impact is actually pretty poor with the scooters, particularly because they have they last 2 or 3 months at maximum, and then you have to replace them. Plus the redistribution issues as well. So you have to choose good vehicles. But for me, the main issue concerns the actual scooter itself, and I'm surprised that this wasn't included within the regulations provided for operators to have scooters. There are scooters available now that do last longer time, but there's still an awful lot of scooters around there which die after 2 or 3 months, and that really pulls down their environmental or creates a much worse environmental impact.
Nick, let's come to you.
Yeah, just to move on, that's a really good point, because it's the batteries as well. We did a bit of research on it, and the battery life is not long. The manufacture is part of it as well, and then when it's discarded, which many of them will be after not very long, There's a real problem with acidification as well, because the batteries being not disposed of properly. So all of these things really need to be talked about. They're not generally, you don't see a lot on them in some of the general stuff about e-scooters, but they're definitely happening behind the scenes.
Thanks. David, do you want to come in?
Just a quick one, please. People have talked about batteries. Obviously, that's a problem. I'm not sure that people realise this is probably more of an issue in relation to privately purchased ones. If you get a puncture, it's very hard to fix it. And my excellent local bike shop says they will not touch them because the wheels are so small and it can be quite difficult to buy inner tubes for them, that it's just not feasible or worth their while. So, you know, cyclists hate punctures, but most of us learn to fix them, and a bike shop will sort you out. But you could find you get a puncture on your first trip and your scooter's off the road.
Brian.
Yeah, just wanted to say, I just recently wrote a report on decarbonising transport, the climate safe streets one with the London Cycling Campaign, and we really ummed and ahed about whether e-scooters were actually part of the problem, really, when it came to decarbonisation. It is getting better, as Kerry said, but I remember the figures off the top of my head, and a lot of these are from Kerry, so I hope you won't correct me if I get them wrong. But like 261 grams of CO2, it's like per kilometre for a car. It's 126 from some of the reports I've seen for e-scooters compared to 21 for a standard bike. So we were like, we don't really make the case for decarbonisation there, but I think if we can get on top of the regulations post-trial, then that these really could be part of the solution. But at the moment, yeah, they're definitely in the part of the problem camp, but getting better.
Lorna.
Yeah, I think that's all really interesting points, and I think one of the most interesting things about e-scooters is how much their total life cycle emissions depend on the type of regulations that we've been talking about in the previous two sections. So if your local authority is requiring that you collect up scooters every night, if your local authority is requiring a lot of active redistribution, then that normally adds a reasonable amount of carbon, although you can require that to be done by cargo bikes, by cargo e-bikes, but again, then that might reduce the profitability. So I think it is, to answer the question, really important, and I think it is one of the things we should be tracking, so that when we're evaluating the trials, we can see what sort of trade-offs of we get this much better social impact, but it costs us this much extra carbon. Is that worthwhile?
Thank you. Great answers. Very interesting. Next question. Do we need an instant change to the Stats 19 codes to allow for scooters, electric bicycles, etc.? Lorna, I'm going to come straight back to you on this one, into the level of animation that I'm seeing here.
I was emailing about Stats 19 codes yesterday. So Stats 19 are the way that the police collect their road traffic accident statistics. So I think it would be a very good thing to have a e-scooter Stats 19 code. The problem is that that data set is based on incidents reported to the police. So that will almost certainly capture the car drives into scooter, but the person falls off a scooter, or scooter drives into a pedestrian, unless it's very serious, is unlikely to make its way into Stats 19. So I think we also need to be thinking about what other data sets we might need to start adding an e-scooter code to.
Okay, thank you. David.
Well, actually, Stats 19 is now being upgraded to something called Crash, which is an online version or an app version of Stats 19, and half the police forces have moved to that, and that is much better. But I believe there is already a code for e-scooters. I think the challenge might be pointing it out to some of the police officers that fill it in. So I believe that is already there. But you're quite right, Laura. Two things. First of all, the gross underreporting of these types of collision, and secondly, the accuracy of some of the reporting of these. In fact, now people are encouraged to report themselves online rather than expect a police officer to turn up to the scene. So those are some of the sort of issues.
Okay, anyone else want to come in on this one? Kerry.
I can talk just about a main, more general point about mixing together scooters and cycling as one micro mode. I notice now that people are talking about micro mobility, which includes bicycles and e-packs. Now, I think that's a dodgy route to go around, because they have, not only do they have different crash and safety data and statistics, but they also have different benefits as well. Cycling is much more of an active mode than scooters, and I think when public authorities are looking to make the case for infrastructure, they have to weigh up the benefits and the costs. And if we mix scootering and cycling together, we may have more costs and less benefits. I know people, when you're using the heat tool, for example, if we now include scooters within that, we will not be able to make as good a case for cycling infrastructure. So we need to be careful about mixing together cycling and scootering. They are different modes, the different uses, different benefits and different costs as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, we do have a representative from the Met Police on this webinar, but unfortunately, apparently having audio issues. So we will come back to them as and when we can.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Oh, hello, sorry.
Yeah, hello, it's Dan Card from the Met Police. Can you hear me?
Ah, Dan, yes, we can. Yes, we can. You want to come in on this point?
Yes. So we do have codes for e-scooters in terms of Stats 19 to answer your question. The issue we've got is, as one of the panelists highlighted here, when there's a car involved, people know that when you crash a car, you need to report an accident. Because e-scooters at the moment, there's a question of whether they're mechanically propelled vehicles or motor vehicles. Now, for motor vehicles, you would certainly have to report a collision on the road. For mechanically propelled vehicles, not always the case. And also the issue is, like you said, that if you have a e-scooter versus a pedestrian or an e-scooter versus a cyclist, what actual details do you give? Because potentially there's no legal requirement for anybody to give any of those details. So it's very difficult to track the instances of collisions, and especially when they're potentially taking place at fairly low speed and the injuries aren't that serious that people feel the need to report it to the police. You then get issues of probably significant under-recording, I'd imagine.
Thank you for that contribution. That's really interesting. Just to editorialise for a second, but we're kind of been talking to DFT about this, and DFT assure us they're talking to the police. But I know from bike share that coordination with police forces and the way they're structured can be a bit difficult. So it's something we've very much got our eye on through the tribe.
I've been speaking, funnily enough, I've been speaking to the DFT this week, their policy team, with Dave Snelling and Glenn Wallace-Jones about how we're classifying the use of e-scooters and some of the other issues going forward. So it's very much a conversation that's going on. But as some of your panel alluded to, it's moving forward quite quickly. So we're trying to keep pace with it as it's going. But it's certainly a conversation that's being had.
Thank you, Dan. Also really interesting. Much appreciate you being on the call, and that's good to hear. Let's move on to another question, please. Are e-scooters any more or less dangerous than motor vehicles according to statistical studies? Would anyone like to come in on that? Brian, go for it.
Well, I kind of started off by making this speech, so I kind of can refer back to that, really, of the danger they pose and the risk to yourself as a person. It definitely seems in the quite risky camp, particularly if you're interacting with cars on the road, which is where most of the source of the danger is. So definitely from that point of view. But in terms of the things that I worry about as a designer, I'm worrying about trucks, I'm worrying about like cars in terms of like protecting people from them. Really, when it comes to a scooter, it's how do I protect them from the more dangerous issues out there. I mean, it's like the point I said, the stat from the ITF and the OECD on like that 4% of the collisions are involving pedestrians with e-scooters worldwide, and that's a real key point to note, that they're not really maybe they're being underreported, might be a case, but even if it's even if it is, it's still the risk is all about the large dangerous ones out there. And if this is a way of getting someone to switch, then I'm always going to say we're going to get safer streets if there's more people in e-scooters. than there are on cars, and that's the way I see it, and I haven't seen any evidence that disregards that. I want to make that point again.
Thank you. Kerry, to come to you.
Yeah, I agree that the studies that I've seen from other European cities and countries, I've sort of summed them up as more likely to have a crash incident on a scooter than a bicycle. Fatalities and injury rates are similar, but serious injury rates seem to be higher for scooters. The third-party crashes with other pedestrians and cyclists is very low, similar to cyclists. Most fatalities, serious injuries come about as a result of a crash with a motorbike, with a motor vehicle, just like cyclists. 90-odd%. Surface and weather is also an issue, but pinch of salt because the data is not fantastic, obviously. But as Brian says, you know, 1.5 ton, 200 horsepower a vehicle. That's where the danger lies on our roads, really. We can also look at serious injuries for single crashes as well, but especially when we're looking at third-party crashes, we're looking at cars, and in some cities like London, large trucks and lorries and construction trucks. That's where the real danger lies.
Thank you. David.
Well, I mean, of course, I would agree with Brian that the object is to have a few of the most dangerous vehicles, such as cars and trucks, on our roads. Interestingly, actually, motorcycles have the highest rate of injury, not only to the motorcyclist, but to other road users of any group of vehicles. And I think we tend to overlook them, but they are, of course, a sort of small percentage of the traffic. So yeah, as I said earlier, 80% of deaths on the road involve a car. But it's very important to remember, you know, who kills whom. But I think in relation to e-scooters, we have the problem that actually the vast majority of e-scooter injuries, and I totally agree with what Kerry was saying, but it's not so much fatalities, it's actually more about serious injuries, are due to the scooter rider just coming off. It's not about being run over by a truck or a car. So I think we have that issue to contend with. And now that's not the same for pedal cyclists. So I think, you know, and another thing is a point I made earlier, that the benefits, we talked about getting, you know, that it's safer than cars, fair enough, but to what extent are we going to reduce car use by promoting e-scooters? And frankly, as with so many green transport initiatives, it's much more about tackling car use rather than promoting public transport or walking and so forth. You know, we have to have policies like the congestion charge, like parking restrictions, like pricing, which I'm sorry at the moment some cities are doing. I agree, some cities are doing, but the government is not particularly in that camp. So if you want to have fewer cars, because the trouble is you might get one person switching to an e-scooter, and that leaves more space on the road. And this is the trouble we've had with school travel plans. You know, one parent walks their kids to school, and another parent thinks, oh, it's less busy now, I'll drive. So I think we have to look at the mix. And if we have got people switching from walking, from public transport, which is much, much safer, to e-scooters, that has to be set against any benefit from a few more or a few less car trips.
Okay, thank you. I will move us. Oh, Kerry, do you want to come back just briefly, if you will?
Yeah, just very quickly, but we have to remember that a lot of this data comes from 2016, 17, 18. And since then, there's been a lot of regulation being put in place. So speed limits are being checked. You're no longer allowed to ride on the pavement. So you'll probably see a fall in scootering issues over the next few years, because the regulations are now coming in place across Europe.
Thank you, that's helpful. Let's move to another question. What are people's thoughts on older people and people coming out of shielding who cannot walk or move as easily as now, and how they'll deal with rentable e-scooters that will be on the pavement or in public space? And how do you think blind and partially sighted people are going to manage with these e-scooters when they're being ridden and when they're not being ridden? Anyone want to come in on that? Lorna, I'll come to you.
Yeah, so I think the question about older people is interesting, because there is potentially a way that e-scooters could be a good thing for a lot of people who would struggle to walk short distances, but who would have the capacity to use an e-scooter. There's the lovely video of Margaret Atwood whizzing around a car park. And so there is a population who might benefit from having e-scooters available. And some of the discussion around the London Cycling Campaign decision to endorse or to kind of go with e-scooters was that to welcome this broad spectrum of wheeled mobility, so that it didn't really matter whether you were on a bike or an e-scooter or a mobility scooter, you were all just a normal part of the street scene. So there is an argument that it could be beneficial. Then there is the street nuisance. Street doesn't look as nice as it did, so I don't really want to walk aspect. And then there is the street clutter aspect. The street clutter aspect is a particular issue for blind and partially sighted pedestrians because of the nature of e-scooters. If they are parked freely, you can't learn where they are on your route, and because of the lighter vehicle, they're quite easy to knock over with a cane, or quite easy to get your cane tangled in them. So on that perspective, really good parking corrals would help a lot. I'm not going to totally rant about streetscape and street furniture and street clutter. I think if you start looking at pavements with a critical eye, this idea that a pavement is a safe haven for pedestrians is not as true in real life as it is now. And I think there is a lot of other stuff that is on the pavement that you could argue should not be there or should be elsewhere. But I wouldn't want to use that as an argument of, oh, well, it's already quite bad, so let's just let it get worse.
Thank you. Who else wants to come in? David, your hand's up.
A quick one. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave in a moment, so this will be my last comment, which some people might be relieved about. But anyway, it's been great to take part. Just to say, the evidence session of the Transport Select Committee on Wednesday this week took evidence from Living Streets and the National Royal Institute for the Blind. And I would really urge people, it was a very good session, and there's lots of really good information and evidence that's come out of that. There will be another session in about 10 days' time with the Minister, and I think some people from the industry. So it's a shame, from our point of view, it's a shame the government hasn't waited to learn from that. But if you're interested in e-scooters, I definitely go to the Select Committee webpage and watch it or read it. So thanks everyone, and I apologise, I must go.
All right, thank you, David. Anyone else on this question? Brian.
I just wanted to say on this issue, I kind of feel we have the engineering solutions to deal with a lot of this, and that's kind of what's part of the trial, particularly while they're on the rental market and we're speaking to the suppliers. A lot of it's been mentioned that we can reduce speed. You can geo-fence that the things won't go on footways or in certain areas. So and you know, we can sort out like corrals and docking stations are the left in the right places. It's all within our gift. It's just go back to like learning the lessons from Dockless, managing it properly, and we can have a successful trial, and we can move on to integrating these things in the street scene without them affecting pedestrians or visually impaired people in a negative way. We just have to do it properly, but all the techniques and all the technologies there, I think we can get it right this time and make a good case for micro mobility. So that.
Thank you. Nick.
Just a really quick one, because I don't think it's been mentioned, and it doesn't particularly apply to people who are older, but there is evidence to suggest that training and experience are really important with e-scooters, and the more you've ridden an e-scooter, the less likely you are to either injure yourself or injure someone else. So any rollout would have to include a lot of engagement and a lot of explaining how to use the things as well.
Thank you. Let's move on to another question. We have a large housing development going through planning. What can we do to embed e-scooters in the green transport plan? We are a town of 40,000 with a mainline station and almost no buses. Who would like to offer a thought? Brian.
Well, I'm always happy to come in there, and this is the issue. Like people think about central London in particular, or what would they do there? But the whole rest of the UK is ripe for these things. We've got not many people doing kind of longer walking trips. They're taking the car to go like less than a kilometre. This might be a way of getting to those no way, no how people on bikes and getting to actually consider other options. If you're at the bottom of a long cul-de-sac that's really annoying to walk out, it could be like, well, you ride on the carriageway there, you go on the asphalt footway. It's definitely, it should be part of the mix. So I think it's one of those like cheaper options to offer in a new housing estate, and they're going up all over the place, and they're really like embedded car-centric approaches in there that we've not really learned any of the lessons in our planning, particularly when you get outside of London. So it's a real issue that this could fill a gap. If you're going to pop to the shop, don't take your car, take the e-scooter. I mean, I'm like Kerry, I'd much rather that rode their bike, but you know, you have got the issue with storage as well. Obviously, it's not as much as storing a car. So for me, it's going to be part of the solution. I'd love to see like a new slightly out of town development that promoted e-scooters and did it well. And I think that would be a real selling point. People don't want to have to rely on the cars, but we still have that baked into our planning process, and we have to do something about it to tackle some of the bigger issues. What I'd like to say on that.
Richard, if I'm all right to jump in, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So, I mean, I suppose we've got some experience of this in the West Midlands. I think if you consider this in the aspect of A, availability, and then B, propensity. So availability of the services, availability of usership of the infrastructure that's put in place as well. So how easy is it for people to actually access a particular service, e-scooters or otherwise? But that's within essentially the gift of the developer to make that site accessible, whether that be demarcation of lanes, or whether that be mobility hubs of a description that gave easy access to a variety of modes for that population. As part of that is also understanding what the makeup of that population is. Is it mainly young? Is it affluent? Is it deprived? To then scheme the appropriate mobility services and to give a selection so it actually offers some viable choice. And then coupled with that is the propensity for those people to take it. Does that require a level of incentivization? So, you know, around offering incentives for usership on certain modes. And I think there's a lot to go at in that sort of space. And we, within the West Midlands, are looking at ways that we can, with new development sites, offer a package of activity that takes some of the funding that's allocated to the Section 106 money and actually offers viable choice for people. So it's not just a standardised bus service. It is properly planned out infrastructure alongside a set of mobility options that therefore people have a choice that they represents something which means they don't necessarily have to always take the car. The car doesn't have to be default. So I think it's a complex answer, but there are a number of things that we think the developers can do to encourage and facilitate change.
Thank you. Lorna.
Yeah, just quickly thinking about this one. Realistically, from both a health from active travel point of view and a decarbonisation point of view, what we would love is for everyone who could walk or bike to walk or bike, and then e-scooters to only be used by people who can't walk or bike. And we accept that there are both physical and social factors that might impact on that. And the evidence that we are seeing from most other places is that if your area is good for cyclists, it is good for e-scooters because they will have segregated personal mobility or light individual transport lanes. And if you have secure parking for bikes, then you're likely to be able to put scooters there as well. And we know a lot about making areas good for cyclists. So you could, from a starting point, say, if this is a good area for cyclists, it's probably also a good area for e-scootering as well, with the addition of thinking about where you would put those parking corrals, what density of parking corral might you need. So I live in Hackney, where they've taken on-street car parking spaces away and designated them as doctors' bike parking spaces. There's nice things from the States about putting your dockless parking corral at the corners around the junctions, where you might not want to park cars because it would impinge visibility too much, but because they're just little scooters, you can put them there. Then they're on street corners and people know they just have to walk to the end of the street to pick one up. And if you were going super luxe, then you could have a look at New Zealand and the Lockheed docks. You could speak to Como about their mobility hubs, about are there things that you could put in that would allow people to park and charge e-scooters. I am bearing in mind that we're only allowed rental ones at the moment, so it would be for rental scooters to be charged. But if you were thinking forward, we are expecting private e-scooters to be legalised. If everything goes well, maybe, then that is a way you could future-proof.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that? In which case, I will move us on. Should users have training or licenses to use e-scooters? Brian, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think it's sensible during the trial to do this, but I'm a little bit worried about the thin end of the wedge. We've been fighting for cycling for 100 years to not have licenses and of automatic training, and when people are trying to enforce it on e-scooter users before they've really got an established body that's taking care of their rights and their needs in society, I'm a little bit worried that it might all get shoveled through before anybody's there to complain, and then in a few years they go, oh, this is a real nightmare. We're stopping certain members of society from using the system, and it's like holding back the growth when, like I say, we need these things to decarbonise transport, and there's some real positive aims out of them. So I get really worried about all the legislation before there's a real user group to argue the case against. So that's my main take on it. I'm worried about compulsory helmet use and compulsory licenses. They're two words that fill me with horror as someone who's always been promoting cycling. So I'm worried about that coming in. But I think it's sensible during the trial while we're getting used to these things, and it's always good to offer training. But again, it's not been made compulsory during the trial, and I'd be worried about what precedent we were setting and whether people say, well, we're doing it for e-scooters, should we do it for bikes? And then I have to go through all that palaver again, which I've only got so many calories of energy to deal with. So that's my worry on that side, but sensible during the trial.
All right, thank you. Kerry.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, if you want to, this just throws up friction to use of scooters and bicycles. You want to make it as slippery as possible so that people don't have to go somewhere, do something, pay for something if you want them to use these services. We find that when authorities have put in licensing for cyclists, they've changed pretty quickly, or they've done research on it. They've shown that there isn't a great deal of benefit for the cost that you'll impart because of the lack of people cycling, and the people will stop cycling and you won't get new cyclists. And I would assume that you'll have a similar issue with the scooters. I think you can recommend training, or you can provide training. Make sure you can provide it for people if they want to have it, but making it compulsory would be an issue, I think, if you want these services to take off.
Lorna.
Yeah, just quickly, I totally understand the reason that we are requiring driving licenses during the trial period, but I think it is important to flag from a social justice point of view that women, people from ethnic minorities and poorer people are a lot less likely to have a driving license than white affluent men. And as someone said to me, well, it's only a £34 provisional license that you have to get and fill in this very long form. So I think when we get the usage statistics, I am expecting that it will show that most e-scooter users, particularly in dense urban areas, will be white affluent men. But I also think we'll have to view them through the perspective that the design of our trial did exclude some of the groups who might have benefited most from being able to use e-scooters because of this necessary requirement for this first 12 months, because of the way the legislation fudge has been written, that people need to have a driving license to access them.
Thank you. Really interesting point. Slightly building on that, actually, just moving to next question. I'm conscious of time. We are just coming up to the end of our time. With panelist agreement, I'll just run on for one more question. What about market towns and rural settlements where public transport's often poor, roadwork networks not ideal? Is this yet another urban-rural divide challenge? Brian.
I'm always useful to come in while people are thinking, you know, but yeah, I live in a rural town and it'd be really quite useful around there. I think to an extent, it was interesting to see from the survey that people felt it was like really important in inner cities where usually, like I wasn't going to mention COVID, but like without COVID, people are relying on buses and cycling and walking, and they have those options. Where in the rural areas, everybody seems to be relying on cars, and there's a real high propensity to use the car there because in some cases they don't have footways. But if there's anything that can put a dent in it, then maybe the use of e-scooters could be a way, and it'd be interesting to trial it in a rural area. I live in a town of about 30,000 people, and it'd be really interesting to trial in somewhere of that size. For me, it'd be a real benefit, and I think a lot of people would buy into it. And most of our pavements are blocked with cars anyway, so there's that issue. People need to get around without the car, then they need to get on the carriageway, and then bikes obviously would be a first choice. But again, there's going to be a lot of people that will struggle with that, but might have a go on an e-scooter. So I think it's perfect for that situation personally.
Can I just jump in? Oh, sorry.
No, go for it, Mark.
I think, yeah, we recognise this issue certainly within the West Mids. The zones that we've prescribed are a bit of a mixture of city centre to town centre to into the sort of rural areas, again, so that we can get a perspective on what that looks like and what the usership looks like. I think the initial conversations with a lot of the suppliers is they are chasing density. That's how their business models are predicated. But those are sort of predicated equally to having short lease or hop on off. Now, those that are offering longer lease perspectives on business cases, and those might lend themselves better to the rural use case, potentially, whereby they're not quite so dependent on a constant stream of people, and also the charging characteristics of the scooters are different and they're owned and used differently. So I think there is opportunity across the patch, and this trial is therefore an ideal opportunity to see how the usership actually changes for those different sort of use cases. So yeah, well, I suppose that one's a bit watch this space.
Thank you for that. Lorna, did you want to come in?
Mostly just going to say everything Mark has just said, and I'm super excited that they're going to have some trials in some less urban areas. I grew up in a market town where it was 15 minutes walk to the town centre. I can see scooters being incredibly popular. I can also see it being the one place where you might want to have a look at a more fully dockless mode. So you might want to, in your town centre, have corrals, but consider in your suburbs whether you're going to be able to get the density of permissible parking spaces, and if you've got low walking frequency anyway, whether your pavements might be clear enough to allow some fully free floating schemes, perhaps with requirements to do things like send a photo to show that you haven't parked it parallel across the entire pavement. I think it would be really interesting to see if there are any local authorities that run in semi-urban market town areas and how they regulate their trial to make it profitable for the users, for the operators.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to come in on that? I think I'm going to squeeze in one more final question, and then we will come to a close, conscious of everyone's time and diaries. What does the panel see as the best practice design principles for e-scooters? For example, larger wheel size has been demonstrated to show they can more safely navigate potholes. Kerry.
I think with respect to the speed, I think 25 is probably a little high, because especially with a 500 watt motor, I think that 25 kilometers per hour will be hit quite a lot. Whereas with the power assisted bicycles, they tend to have a speed only a couple of kilometers per hour higher than a normal bicycle, which is between the 15 and 20. So they're probably 17 kilometers per hour on an average journey. They have a 250 watt motor plus the pedal power as well, but that will be less than the 500 watts that you have for the lighter scooter. So I would think that the speed difference, there will be a speed difference between the scooters and the bicycles, and even the power assisted bicycles on the cycling infrastructure. In an ideal world, you could perhaps have 25 on the roads, 20 on the cycling infrastructure. And if you were to allow them to mix with pedestrians, then under 10, 8, 7, 6 kilometers per hour. So worry with the speed.
All right, thank you. Lorna, did you want to come in on this?
I am laughing because my initial thought when that question came in is that we would want them to look as much like a bicycle as possible. But then I was reminded of the really interesting stats that came out of the States, which were that when the micromobility providers offered both e-bikes and e-scooters were massively more popular than e-bikes. People like riding them. So that is not a useful answer to that question at all. Sorry.
Can I come in there?
If I might step in a second, it's a really good point. And it's the point that, you know, rather gets underplayed in green transport debates, I think, about what people actually like to do. Any other panelists want to come in on this point?
Yeah, Dan Card from Met Police.
Oh, hi, Dan. Sure.
Yeah, so obviously we've been focused on these since the tragic accident involving Emily Hartridge last year on an e-scooter. And there's stuff that's going forward to the coroners, so I can't go into huge detail, but certainly some of the representations we've put forward to the DFT for specs of scooters would be around ensuring they have pneumatic tyres to deal with the slightly uneven road surfaces they're going to encounter, lights on them to ensure they're visible to people, and also, strangely enough, that they make a noise so that people that are slightly hard of hearing can actually hear them approaching rather than silently sneaking up sort of behind people. Just those three things. There are a myriad of other things that are on our wish list, but certainly those sort of three things are things we'd look at, along potentially with tyre size to come away from the smaller tyres.
Thank you, that's really useful. Kerry.
I was surprised that brakes weren't also put on the they don't have to have brakes on the pilot projects as well. There are some countries like Germany, for example, which has brakes and there's lights, and they've had much sort of stricter guidelines for the vehicles themselves, because there isn't really a European standard as such, or I guess a German Netherlands type group. There's a scooter standard. There's no real scooter standard. So I think as careful as possible. We should be looking at things like brakes and things like that as well.
Yeah, brakes was something else we spoke about. So, you know, as I say, they're on our wish list. There's about another 3 or 4 things we'd like on there. You know, we're not greatly in support of having seats on scooters. We think that standing is probably the best way to go with them. There are lots of things on there in our submission. Along with we feel they should have licenses. Going back to the point before that I didn't come in on, we're a believer that you should have a minimum of a provisional license to ride one of these, because they are a mechanically propelled vehicle. They're not a cycle.
Thank you. Brian.
Just a really tiny point on this, really, just because I've been thinking about this just as a design engineer, and just the way these things move, and whether people are having the feet side by side, or whether it's one front or one back. And but for the engineers in the UK, we haven't really seen these things in too much operation, so we kind of have to get used to them to know, you know, what kind of turning radii we need to keep comfortable. At the moment, we think they fit within the parameters that we associate with cyclists, but there will be some nuance to it, particularly about the lateral turn. So I've been giving that a bit of thought, but I don't know, but it'd be interesting. And I'll usually phone Kerry when I have questions like this anyway, so it's good to hear him talk about it.
Seems like a very wise policy. I'll draw us to a close there, if I may. Thank you very much to all my panelists. Thank you to all the contributors in the question box, much appreciated. Thank you very much to Detective Inspector Dan Card on the line also. I've learned as I've gone along through this, so my thanks too. my big picture point to end on is that there's a huge amount to learn here, and I think we can try and seize on the fact the UK is a really late developer in this space and learn from what's gone on in other countries. There's an obvious opportunity to do that through these trials. But there is a big picture point about trying to turn ourselves as a country away from the private car. So if you like, the exam question for e-scooters, I think in my mind is, how do they help us do that? Do they help us do that? So very much looking forward to this next year of finding out, and I close with thanks for this, and see you all soon at some event, I hope. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Cheers.